Sylvia Plath was a poet, and she turned into a bit of a feminist icon after her death. And heads up, this book is about depression and suicide. So there's my parental advisory warning of sorts. But yeah, even if you've never read anything by Sylvia Plath, you know that she did kill herself. I'm not saying that to be funny, I'm saying that because that's literally the thing that people know about her. She falls into the same group with guys like David Foster Wallace and Kurt Cobain, and you always kind of wonder, what would have happened if they had stayed alive, basically. And in the same sense, knowing that about Plath changes the way you read her work. And I think that's a really important thing to make note of with this book, is that it is actually pretty autobiographical, right? Technically it's fiction, technically it's a novel, but from what I gather, basically the entire thing is based off of Plath's own life. The main character, Esther Greenwood, is essentially a stand-in for Plath. And so reading the book is a bit of a weird experience because it is fiction, technically. It is a novel, like I said, but at the same time, you can't help but think about Plath herself. You can't help but see the author behind the scenes. And the book is written in the first person, and so because of that, a lot of what Esther says, I can only assume, is how Plath actually felt. And I don't think I'm exaggerating just how based and steeped in fact this is. This is a book that was published in Britain originally and not in America, which is kind of weird because Plath is an American author, right? But the reason why it was only published in Britain during her lifetime was because of the fact that she and her mother and some other people felt that if the book were to come out in America, that it would basically cause problems just because of the fact that so many characters are just thinly veiled real life people. And there's even an interview with some of the people who characters were based off of. And these people were like, yeah, this book caused my divorce. And it's like, okay, that's pretty heavy. And I think it's hard to read this book without that in mind. Just the idea that this book is based in reality. This book is based on real things that happened. And of course, Plath was a writer, so I'm sure that she changed some things here, or she glamorized a little bit here, or whatever. I think that she probably made some alterations just because that's the way writing works. But at the end of the day, if you read this book and then you compare it to a biography of her life, there's a lot of overlap. I'm not going to say that it's a circle, but there's a lot of overlap. So in my mind, this book is kind of cut into two halves. It's not divided into two sections, but that's how it exists in my mind. And so basically the first half of the section is just Esther, the stand-in for Plath, living it up in New York. She's 19 years old, she's a college student, she's an editor on this magazine, and people are giving her stuff, people are taking her to fancy dinners, she's having a great time, and it's not all roses and sunshine, there are some bad things that happen. Her entire group gets food poisoning, she gets assaulted one night. But the thing is that even though some bad things do happen, I feel like a lot of the way that she writes about this section is actually quite positive, but still the cracks are starting to show in this section. For instance, there is a section where she's supposed to be taking photographs for her magazine, but she just kind of breaks down and cries. And if I'm not mistaken, very early on, she talks about how there are a lot of people who would kill to be in her position, but she's kind of bored of it, she's kind of tired of it. And then the second half of the book is more directly about her experiences with depression and suicide. So she lives in a mental hospital in the second half of the book. And I think Esther is an interesting character. This is a stand-in for Plath, but Plath doesn't try to make herself look perfect. She doesn't try to make this fictionalized version of herself look perfect. Esther is honestly kind of a weirdo. She just won't stop eating food, right? That's like part of her character, is she just eats other people's food. And Plath doesn't depict herself as a saint, who just helps everyone, anyone. For instance, Doreen, who is a friend of Esther's, shows up at Esther's motel room, drunk and passing out, and Esther just kind of leaves her in the hallway. She doesn't help Doreen back to her own room. She just kind of leaves her, which is definitely not a nice thing to do. But I think that's what makes this book work, is just the fact that Plath doesn't make herself look perfect. I think that if you do any kind of book like this that's based off of your life in any capacity, you have to acknowledge faults, because you're not Superman, right? You're not gonna always make the right decision. That's one thing I've seen a lot in other people's stories, is they will have characters who they get really attached to, or they'll have characters that are stand-ins for themselves. But the thing is that in those stories, oftentimes the writers will make everything go right for that character. They'll make everything go right for the characters who they care about and who are special to them. And that's just not engaging. It doesn't make for a good story. And so I think that's why this book can work as fiction, is just because of that fact that Esther isn't perfect. So there are a lot of things that are talked about in this book that probably would have been kind of challenging back in 1963 when it originally came out. Things like I've mentioned, depression, mental illness, suicide attempts, sex, virginity, double standards, the idea that a woman can just have a career. You know, Esther just wants to be a poet and she doesn't want to have a family and a husband. So I don't think that the book is going to be shocking to anyone who reads it now, honestly. So I want to talk about some of the best things about the book and some of the worst things. One of my absolute favorite things about the book is the way that depression is handled in this book, because usually whenever you see a depressed character in a piece of media, they're like, oh, I'm so depressed, I'm so sad, and they make it clear, right? Esther doesn't really do that. Even though it's written from the first person and you're in her head, she doesn't make it clear that, you know, oh, I'm depressed. In the first half of the book, in the New York section, like I said, there are parts where the cracks are showing. But even when the depression really takes over the story and Esther tries to kill herself a couple of times, she never has like a woe is me attitude towards it. She never tries to make you feel pity for her or feel bad about her. And she talks about suicide like it's nothing, like she's used to it. And honestly, that is one of the best depictions of suicidal thoughts I've ever seen, because of the fact that when you do have suicidal thoughts for a long period of time, you get used to it. You just think about it like it's absolutely nothing. And that's exactly the way it's depicted in this book. It's not depicted as anything grand or extreme or anything like that. It's depicted as just, you know, another thing to do. And if that sounds really dark and depressing and sad, it is. It is, but the book doesn't treat it like that. And so that's what makes it interesting to me. As an external observer, I think that you can look at Esther's situation and you can go, yeah, this is pretty bad. This is pretty screwed up. But Esther herself doesn't really do that, you know, and I think that a lot of that is just because she is under the influence of depression. And so if you're looking to know more about what having depression is like, then this book might be worth checking out. And I'm not saying that this is the only way that depression manifests, because it's not. But it is one form, and I think it depicts that form pretty accurately. Another thing that I really like about it is the fact that the writing, for the most part, is pretty solid. It's pretty enjoyable to read. There are some parts pretty early on where it is kind of not so great. In the first third of the book, give or take, there were multiple points where I had to stop reading and I had to just go, wow, that was a bad metaphor, or that was a sloppy sentence or something. And I don't normally do that with books. Normally just stray sentences don't faze me, but there was just something about some of these sentences that made me stop and made me go, okay, this is kind of not so great. And so I don't know if it was just me. I don't know if what happened is I got used to her writing style, and so that's why I enjoyed the rest of the book. But like I said, the first third has some stuff that doesn't quite work for me. Another thing I don't like about this book is the fact that it does cover a period of Esther's life, you know, just from one starting point to the next. And it does jump around a little bit. There are some flashbacks here and there. And I don't feel like all the flashbacks are necessary, if I'm being completely honest. I just don't like flashbacks in general. I'm biased against them. And then even though this book is pretty short, it's like 240 pages, I almost wish that it had been more directed, right? I wish it had been more pointed in some ways. Because some of the New York stuff is just kind of, it's fine, but I think that it would have benefited a bit from being trimmed down. So in conclusion, this book's good. I like it. I don't think it's a 5 out of 5, you know, perfect book, but I think it's good. I think it's good. So if it sounds interesting to you, then check it out. So thank you.